Hello everyone, I'm Urshka from Lendezin and we are hosting today Lydia Kallipoliti with her newly published book Histories of Ecological Design, an Unfinished Cyclopedia. I will first make a short introduction and then I will leave Lydia to say a few words about her book, to present her book, and we will have a short Q&A following. So Lydia Kallipoliti is an award-winning architect, engineer, scholar, curator, and associate professor at the Cooper Union University in New York. Kallipoliti also taught at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Syracuse University, and Columbia University. She received a PhD from Princeton University and Master of Science in Architecture Studies from the MIT. Her practice includes prototype exhibitions, hybrid and hologram installations, and writings on ecological design, theory and politics, among other related mediums, through which she can transverse with spearheaded visions. Her work circulates about themes of closing or looping and backfeeding the systems and opening them up. Closing the systems refers to metabolic and cyclical resource processing and reorganization, the much-needed self-encapsulation of the Anthropocene. In the Anthropocene, yet addresses the absurdity of confinement to the specific boundary, that of home or office, in parallel. Opening those up would allow them to germinate, eat and converge excrement, becoming living machines. Lydia Kallipoliti is also the principal of the Ernst Haeckel, a design and writing think tank, where you can discover more about her work to your interest. Exhibited the Venice Biennial, the Istanbul Design Biennial, and the Oslo Architectural Triennale, among others. The list of received awards and recognitions is far too long for us to even start. So we will mention the two books published, the first being The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit, published in 2000 with Lars Miller Publishers, and the second published this year with Akhtar, that we will talk about today. Histories of Ecological Design, an Unfinished Cyclopedia. So Lydia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We will start with the book presentation and then followed by questions and answers. So yes, Lydia, please.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you and present a book that was just released with the title Histories of Ecological Design, an Unfinished Cyclopedia. And if we look at the term ecological design, it was very recently coined, only in 1996, by Sim van Deren, who was a very important state architect in California, and Stuart Cowan, where they argued that basically ecological design was a seamless integration of human activities with natural processes to minimize destructive environmental impact. What I'm arguing for in this book is quite contrary to this belief. Instead of the call to fit harmoniously with the natural world, ecological design might also be understood as a form of synthetic naturalism, where the laws of nature and metabolism are displaced from the domain of wilderness and transposed to the domain of cities, buildings, and objects. So, Histories of Ecological Design presents conflicting definitions and concepts of architects and designers and the parallel histories of their intellectual positions toward environmental thought, beginning from the 19th century to contemporary design practice in an unfinished encyclopedia. And you see the context here. There are 18 chapters in 3 periods. So the book showcases overall that ecological design might begin with reconceptualizing the world as a system of flows instead of a discrete compilation of objects, which is an argument that Georgi Kepes made in the 1970s. And he argued that this was the most fundamental reorientation of conceptual thought in the 20th century. There are 3 main periods that are covered in the book that I have tentatively called naturalism, synthetic naturalism, and dark naturalism. And there are 6 chapters in each one of the periods. I'll give very, very brief information for each. So Naturalism starts in 1866 when Ernst Haeckel coined the word ecology, and it basically presents a critique of our deeply ingrained anthroposophical perception of nature since the Enlightenment. What you see on the screen are two representations of Ernst Haeckel, two genealogical trees. And very much like other vegetal representations of the time, trees have been instrumental to the history of ecology, giving form to a colonial project of domination over nature. Trees also forecast a world order resting on an evolving hierarchical society, beginning from men, which are on the top of the tree. On the first tree, you will see the title going all the way to bacteria, which the title in Latin is Monera. So the diagrammatic visual structure of a plant or a tree, which seems innocent, apolitical, and ahistorical, actually upholds power and privilege by positioning certain species and organisms and populations at the top and others in the margins or lower ranks of these kinds of representations. The bifurcation of trees not only implies a linear kind of progress, but also establishes an order and assigns value to all the components of life, arranging living things into ladders, centers, and niches. It generates and maintains, in many ways and forms, social hierarchy. So the origins of ecological design are rooted in a profound desire to idealize the anatomy of natural elements, like the plant or a tree, and the metabolism of living organisms, turning them into conceptual prototypes that allow us to imagine new worlds and new futures based on a natural order. So ecology is the origins of ecology, far from the innocent discipline of being interconnected with nature. Rather, as historian Lily Robin has argued, it can be seen as a science of empire. If we go from the first period of naturalism to this period, synthetic naturalism, we have a different setting for how the colonial project unfolds. So synthetic naturalism, I argue, that starts right after World War II, when the view of the whole Earth was released to the public eye, and it reshaped public imagination of how we understand ecological processes. And here you see on the screen a diagram of a deep section by John McHale, who was a sociologist that worked with Buckminster Fuller. And it starts from the deep core of the Earth, going all the way to the stratosphere. So after World War II, as awareness of planetary disruptions increased, ecological design came to signify not just the natural world, but also the reproduction of the natural world in design principles and tools through technological mediation. It was a kind of world planning, and you see here how basically McHale makes the argument that human activity has infiltrated all of these other geological and atmospheric levels. And the deep section signifies a different kind of colonial project of conquering of space, referred to as world planning. So ecological design is now the design of the entire planet itself, as much as the design of an object, building, or territory. Going to a different period, the representation that we see on the screen is a visualization of NASA for space debris from 1957 to the present. So it's basically the waste that we have exported outside of the Earth. And I'm using the term Thulucene to replace or rethink the contested term of the Anthropocene, which is Donna Haraway's term. And it talks about the turn of the 21st century that marks a new era in environmental debates, which is discernible in the eradication of what was earlier regarded as natural and the naturalization of an ongoing climate crisis. Also, a widespread toxicity that resides not just in the planet itself, but also in human and non-human bodies. So, like Jacques Derrida argued for the evolution of language and culture, we are not given language, but instead it is constructed through social and historical processes. These developments of severe environmental degradation are seen as inevitable or natural. They are naturalized as the kind of default mechanism of the evolution of technological and cultural advancements. This is a distortion of the problem that we have on our hands, and it is the reason why critical discourses in ecological design are vital to reform and rebuild renewed alliances and hierarchies. This long and varied history, or histories in the plural form, is told in a series of narratives that form a matrix of open associations and threads that are read in nonlinear ways. The hope is that this unfinished cyclopedia may produce new interconnected categories, a wayfinding of environmental worldviews. So in the book, you can read the chapters in the order that they are written, but you can also take paths like they're indicated on the screen, and on the book, there's a diagram that prompts you to go from, let's say, taxonomy to world planning and to planetarity, which gives you one continuous thread of an environmental worldview. So in the threads, you can read connected worldviews, each rendering evolving perceptions of nature, their relation to culture, and the occupation of the planet by human and non-human subjects. So there were many objectives in the book, one of which was to emphasize the notion of multiple and parallel histories in the plural form. Another one was to decolonize notions of environmentalism and open the framework of the content to produce a historiography that empowers historically disenfranchised narratives. Throughout the book, there's an acknowledgement and a critique that ecologies reflect hierarchical modalities of dominations, one that are bent on controlling knowledge and shaping the physical and material world into ontological and scientific worldviews. Also, there's this idea that is being challenged throughout that we humans are caretakers of the planet and that the self, as a distinct biological entity, possesses a sublime power to analyze the world, devise hierarchies, and construct ideological cosmologies that become norms. So it is crucial to acknowledge from the outset that the history, this kind of history, is a deeply rooted and extractive colonial project. Despite this disclaimer, in the book, I'm not offering alternative indigenous histories, rather reassessing the values that are entrenched in the various perceptions of ecological design as an ideological instrument and a didactic structure. In addition to writing, which is for me one form of thinking and doing research, the findings of each chapter were illustrated in these original drawings that are enhancing the context of the text and giving a different visual narrative. This material was presented at the Cooper Union in New York in an exhibition that accompanied the book. And the drawings are basically constellations of specific archival objects, images that you see on the screen, each of which is narrated in the text and becoming important to the history. And then they're composed and assembled together in these drawings. So if we take here, I'm kind of highlighting one narrative which speaks about climate or climate control, acclimatizers, climaticists, and resilience. And I'm just going to very briefly show two pictures that it originates the drawing from an old painting in 1790 by artist Robert Dodd, which is called Mutiny on the Bounty, and gives an image of the transference of plants across long sea journeys to colonized territories. And plants were valuable, so in this case, they were stolen. But basically, the device that enabled the geoengineering of territories was the Wardian case, which you see on the screen. It was an early kind of terrarium that was transportable in small scale, and it became the critical technological medium that revolutionized plant transference and colonization. It was widely used in the 19th century because previously plants would die from long sea journeys. So plant transference was critical to colonial territories, which became bioengineering laboratories soon after they were discovered, and places where ideas about health acclimatization, climatic improvement, and spatial design were put into practice. The premises of these tests were based on the hypothesis that the erasure of the innate climatic characteristics would make a climate better for the people coming in, the settler colonialists. The Wardian case, which we saw in a previous slide, becomes the Amazon biospheres, which is the headquarters of Amazon in downtown Seattle. And this was built by NBBJ architects in 2018, spherical leisure spaces that provide well-being for the workers. So this is the workspace of Amazon, and they have taken the effort and the venture capital to transport more than 5,000 species of plants and hire a full-time horticulturalist based on an unconventional study in 2013 that concludes that workspaces that include office plants lead to a 47% boost of employee well-being, a 45% boost of creativity, and a 38% boost of productivity. To develop this plan, Amazon hosted a tropical environment in their office headquarters where specific trees and plants could survive and grow. And they hired a full-time horticulturalist whose name was Ron Galliardo to safeguard the biodiversity and well-being of plant growth. To prepare this venture, his team hosted a number of plant specimens from coffee to cacao trees to smelling corpse flowers originating from over 30 countries, some in danger of extinction. But between the Wardian case and the Amazon leisure spaces, we have the whole history of the climatically controlled office interior, the construction of a calibrated weather-controlled interior that subsequently creates conditioned subjects for specific climates. And the same project, this project of indoor acclimatization, is entangled also with the feats of exploration and colonization. But at the same time, it is enmeshed with the unremarkable experience of everyday life. The regularity of environmental control in most buildings makes evident that we are already part of a universal acclimatization experiment. And according to a 2018 indoor air quality study by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Americans spend 90% of their time indoors. That was also the case before the pandemic. So many of these stories of how different moments in time are connected, you will encounter in the book. Now, to conclude, I'd like to just make a brief note on why I have decided to
name the book An Unfinished Cyclopedia and not an encyclopedia, because the cycling process of ideas is, to me, a form of resistance to the linearity and causality of an encyclopedia and of writing itself. The scope of an encyclopedia is to encircle knowledge in definitive structures and perhaps narrate history as inevitable. Recycling histories and ideas becomes, in this way, a disruption to an idealized continuum or a productive distraction to the arrow of time. So what I argue for is that the process of cycling knowledge is different from encircling it. Cycling shows feedback loops of ideas and practices that circulate and travel in distinct orbits with definitive points of semantic gravity. It also suggests a journey rather than a singular critical perspective that enables voyages between different times, places, and objects. In many ways, encirclement is a mental and political construct that allows all things to be incorporated into controllable and determined worldviews. But the circle is not a given structure upon which power acts. The very task of political action is to encircle and transform knowledge, organic life, and bodies into sovereign entities and instrumentalize them as modes of discourse and hegemonic power structures. But ecology is not one thing. Like water, which exists in various different states and whose power can both instill and destroy life, ecology comprises a universe of fragmented worldviews and their constellations. It is a cloud of stories about human and non-human agencies and the ways in which these encounter the earth, correlate with its parts, nurture it, or are nurtured by it. It is enveloped by ghosts and ideas of what the world should be, engineered fantasies of the interconnectedness of all things, circular reasoning, and the idealization of the natural. If ecological design is in fact a kind of world making, then any account of it must address what a world is for and what a world should become. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. And I really look forward to your questions, Mariska.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you so much. Let me show myself as well. I have multiple questions, and some of them you've addressed already in the presentation. For example, what drove you to write this book, basically, but I will start with a sentence you used or referred to in many of your lectures, is from the toilet papers. Waste speaks of the incomplete perception of the world. So my question would be, it seems that this book is your mission to collect all these ideas and idealisms already been put out there, as all the knowledge have been already discovered but not yet used in a certain way or collected or cycled in a way that would work. Like you said, it's a world of debris basically, or they're very much scattered and not connected. And it works as much as like a pocket whole world catalog, like a textbook of ecology, of identifiable and possibly workable patterns on one hand, and on the other, similarly to your closed worlds, it works as a collection of blurbs, collection of waste ideas in order to critically access or reassess them. So what's the point kind of this book? You already said, but I would like to hear your personal drive.
That is an amazing, it really is an amazing question, because it really hits at the core of how I would like to, how I think, and it's inevitable. It's not how I would like to think, it's how I think. And I think of myself as a scavenger, as someone who collects ideas and keeps them somehow in in storage, and they kind of come out when they need to, but they're also repurposed in different ways. So the quote that you referenced, waste shows an incomplete perception of the world, is really a quote. There was a book by Sim van der Ende, and he's a main character in the book that I'm exploring, and he wrote a book called The Toilet Papers, which really was about composting and the kind of idea of sewage and what we can do with sewage in the 1970s. But it becomes not just a technical, a series of technical objects and ideas, but a philosophical way of seeing the world. And I think he was very much geared by that quote, as were other people in the counterculture in the 70s, that waste, if it is put into a kind of cyclical process of becoming reused and becoming resource again, then the world is kind of going round. And one of the things that I have discovered, which was also present, very much present in my previous book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, was that the idea of kind of perpetual cyclical processes is an impossibility. Just like circular machines were not possible because of friction, and it was a fantasy about life, about energy being perpetual. The same thing is about waste. Like there is always a kind of leftover from processes of recirculation. So this is always something that I'm very cautious about when we see titles about cyclical futures, cyclical design, cyclical narrative. And it's a very important task as long as we can understand it as an impossibility. So in my case, it is a cyclopedia, but it's never a complete circle. It's stories that form different cycles, different journeys, and they can be put together the way a reader wants them to put together. And this is something that's extremely important to me. I was never in agreement that history should be narrated as inevitable, but that history should be written in a serious, intellectual, scholarly way. So I'm hoping that all the chapters, they're not just blurbs, they're more than, they're essays, and they collect with citations and archival material. It's historiographical research about different ideas in specific moments in time, but they can be assembled together in different ways, in different orders, or different kinds of genealogies. And that is something that was present also in my previous book, in my PhD dissertation. I just somehow, I kind of resisted in writing linearly, and I was always writing different in different time periods, like in the future and in the past, and understanding time as in a stretched version. Now, I don't know if that answers entirely the question that you just asked, but this is the way that I have approached this book and the way that I think and write.
Yes, but I'm also interested where do ecology and design converge, and why is it that architecture is so heavily instrumentalized in this process? And since ecology is process-driven or process-oriented, does ecological design need to produce an object that makes it visible? Does it, I mean, I know the book is collection also of all diagrams and all, it's also, these are different kind of objects or visualizations rather, but how to communicate ecology? Basically, I'm interested in why architecture is so obsessed with being ecological or ecological design.
Well, architecture, I wouldn't necessarily argue that architects are obsessed with ecological design. I think that it took decades and years and centuries for architects to understand or conceptualize design as a process of different systems and encounters rather than the design of buildings and environments as objects, right? So I think that this is not, this book, the collection of essays and ideas and stories that are narrated in this book are not mainstream. Some of them are. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright is Broadacre Cities is a very important project, but that a lot of them are also projects or precedents and case studies that no one has ever heard of, and they're extremely marginal. But I think there are two reasons why I wrote this book. One was because there is such a conflation of terms and a confusion about ecology and sustainability and ideas that of how we actually intersect as a discipline with the climate crisis. And the word sustainability is extremely contested in not just in the environmental humanities, but also from architects. And it's not an inspiring kind of word. It's mostly managerial and kind of, you know, it kind of harkens back to a bureaucratic mindset. But also because all of these terms are conflated and convoluted, I just wanted to not put order, but somehow lay them out in the field so that we can see what we have and how we can link ideas and how we can make them palpable to the current age of climate crisis that we are facing. Because inevitably, the way that we think and design, because of environmental degradation and devastating developments, has to change. And it has to change not just in a kind of moral and ethical sense of taking account certain numbers and logistics and the epistemic tradition of measurement, but also in a conceptual way to really understand not just how architects and designers can design objects that can be placed within the environment, but how they can design environments themselves, and how all these kinds of encounters are a design activity. And this is something that I strongly believe in, just like I believe that we need to reinvent systems of infrastructure, systems of moving waste. So all of these kind of little stories that are linked in different ways in the book harken back to small narratives and histories that become pertinent to this objective.
Exactly. I was basically, I see the change where architecture stops being, or is in a sort of a crisis, because I shouldn't be interested anymore in an object, but materiality of the object, where it comes from, where it, in the light of the crisis we face, and of course systems that lay behind all the production. So it's quite important as well. And I wonder also, what is the reciprocity between architecture, ecology, and nature? What is behind the quote, architecture produces nature? You say also, like, you build environments, you build the world, basically.
Yeah.
And that is the nature we see. Of course, nature doesn't exist outside of it any longer, or wilderness, or, you know, it's been, like you said, transferred to the cities, to centers.
Yeah, it doesn't exist as a physical place or artifact, but it exists as an idea. And it's an idealization of what the world should be, or what the world once was that we have lost. And I think that in many ways, many different projects try to replicate that kind of loss. And if we think of the project that I just show, which is with the Amazon, or If we think of different projects like the Eden Project, which really replicate natural systems, but in a controllable way to create large-scale interiors for leisure and for inhabitation, it's very clear that in many ways, in many different projects, architecture is tasked to produce nature, to sustain nature artificially. And that's extremely problematic in many ways or forms, the kind of energy that is wasted to produce that. And it's almost the antithesis or the different pole of different ecological theories like degrowth, which are really about less development, minor interactions, small footprints, and small actions. But the idea of architecture producing nature, I mean, one of the things that I was also trying to argue for is that nature is always a cultural construct. And it has been the case since the beginning, since Haeckel coined the term, kind of presented his different drawings, since German naturalists were going to these long journeys and expeditions to collect things and exemplify their physical endurance. So they were constructing since the beginning what it is to be natural, which was very different from indigenous groups and how they understood what natural is. So there is no such thing as, in a way, it's always a cultural construct and a didactic structure about what the world should be. And my intention was to possibly outline or narrate different versions of these kinds of ideas of didactic structures and constructs.
Mm. You were also saying that the history of ecological design is deeply rooted, extractive, colonial project, as you referred as well now.
Mm-hmm.
And you also mentioned that the importance of cycling ecology is a term, concept that is constantly repositioned in a given time. Yet the book is titled Histories, and the book abruptly ends yesterday. So what do you think follows the dark naturalism?
What follows darkness?
Dark naturalism, except what you state, kind of a needed humility of humanity. So
humility, you said it yourself. Possibly what follows darkness is humility. The possibility of not redrawing the world as a whole, but of understanding smaller objectives, scopes, and places, or that we are not the caretakers of the earth. So one of the things that I was really interested in, not just for this book, but also for my previous one and for, doing research in general, was the idea that if you Google sustainability, just a regular Google search, you will find images of the earth being held in human hands, like people holding the earth like this, as if it's a kind of pet or baby that needs the care of us. And it's such a hubristic way, it's such a hyperbole to think that we can somehow control these planetary developments. So I think what is necessary and possibly inevitable more than necessary is to understand that this kind of hubris is a kind of foregone fantasy, that we are not holding anything in our hands. We are going to die and the earth will not. And that's what it is. We're just part of different stories, different cycles, and the kind of small actions that we can take within these journeys is what matters.
You've gone through so many personalities in history of thinkers and of different profiles, and I wonder, is there a psychological profile of ecology designers or of thinkers in ecology you came to observe? And the subsequent question would be, since architects, landscape architects and planners, we tend to go to look top down from bird perspective or section view, and we now see shift from sterile hygienes or hygienic vision to embracing others and the dirt of all life forms, also by you putting shit into perspective. I'm also wondering what else is unfairly out of our perspective.
I narrate a lot of different characters, and like there's also there are underground personalities that come from anarchist groups, which are my favorite ones, I have to say. But there are also star architects and celebrated figures like Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright was, I think I'm writing about this. I was very interested that he was maybe the persona based on which Ayn Rand wrote The Fountainhead to create the character of Howard Rourke, which was really the exemplification of individualism, human power, kind of rising above all difficulty and so forth. And to me, that's not what an ecological designer is. That's actually the opposite, right? Like an ecological designer, there is a psychological profile, but I'm kind of like, that's a secret to me. Like these are the characters that I'm drawn to naturally. The people that displace their ego or their desire to kind of create artifacts as a kind of, let's say, design of their ego or explosion of their ego in space versus ideas that were simple and exemplified other things beyond the architect. And a lot of times the things were very ugly. Like I have in this mind the architect that I interviewed for my PhD. His name was Graham Kane, and he built an ecological house, which was one of the most extraordinary artifacts. And it was horrible. It was horrible in terms of as a designed object, but the systems and the way that it was circulating and living, it was a living system, a living experiment, was absolutely extraordinary. And I'm drawn to these humble figures that have been marginalized from history in many ways and forms, because they have denied the tools of the discipline to create enchanting or delightful designs that would be admired by colleagues using, tectonic vocabulary and form and all and kind of the code, the aesthetic language that our architects are familiarized with. And they were really trying to invent something which was at the fringes of the discipline. And when a design becomes a living experiment, it goes through a necessary ugliness process. I have observed. Somehow it cannot be the shiny, brilliant object which is finished. It is in the making. So all experiments that are in the making are going through stages that are not perfectly illustrated. And I'm very drawn to this profile.
Thank you. Now, okay, two extra questions is one is, where do you see landscape architecture in ecological design? I mean, you mentioned in the book Ian McHarg, who was kind of the pioneer in this field. And also landscape architecture focuses on the, outside, open space. So it's quite different. It doesn't, whereas architecture is trying to enclose environments. Yeah. Is there any way landscape architecture is as a field, as a design field, relevant in this scope?
I absolutely, it's relevant. I just don't know if I did justice to it in terms of I mean, I think that I'm an architect, I'm not a landscape architect, and I think as an architect, and as you said, architects are trying to recreate and enclose different systems. So the idea of having everything in the open space and kind of designing the outside, is its own discipline, which has its own formation, historical formation, genealogy, and so forth. But it is very true that even though I said ecological design was in 1996 only announced as a title by an architect, landscape architects have been using that term way before that. And they have been using the term for symbiosis of different organisms and plants, and to understand landscape. So, and I actually got a note from someone that's a landscape architect, a well-known, kind of making the argument that even though you say it's 1996, it was way before that, which I completely acknowledge. And I guess I should definitely be apologetic for not making such a distinction. But it is true, and I am thinking through that the book tries to understand the formation of an ecology as an enclosed space, or as a kind of system that can be replicated, not necessarily an open space. I do reference a number of initiatives, like there's a chapter on resilience, which speaks about current landscape practices. There's a chapter on urban activism, which speaks about the, let's say, transference of natural systems to social systems in urban design, and kind of compares planning developments that were top down in comparison to approaches of developing neighborhoods. So there are a lot of chapters and moments in the book that reference the outside, but in many ways and forms, it does focus on architecture as a discipline.
I figured, and also landscape architecture is quite a young discipline on the rise or whatever. And on the other hand, I think it's so interconnected, it shouldn't even exist in a way. I mean, it's so, I think it's already declining. I know you're very busy, so I will let you go now. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.